The smell of Indomie filled the air. It was not just any Indomie, it was Rita's Indomie. Everyone in the village wanted it. The moment the sun rose, people were already rushing to the market square, forming a long queue in front of Rita's small wooden stall. "Rita, please serve me first," a man shouted. "No, I was here before you," another woman argued. Children ran from their houses with coins in their hands, pushing each other just to get a plate. Even grown men fought like hungry dogs, desperate for a taste of Rita's special Indomie. Nobody could explain it, but Rita's Indomie was different. The taste was like magic, soft, delicious, and addictive. No one could get enough of it. The king himself had ordered his wives to stop cooking for him. He ate only Rita's Indomie now. "Bring me more," he would command his guards. And without question, they would rush to the market square, stand in line like common villagers, and buy Indomie for the king. Mothers complained that their children no longer ate their food. "My son refused to eat my soup yesterday," one woman lamented. "Mine too," another woman added. "My daughter cried all night, begging for Rita's Indomie." Even worse, children were now stealing money just to buy Indomie. A small boy was caught sneaking into his mother's purse. "Femi, why are you stealing my money?" the mother shouted. The boy wiped his tears and sobbed, "Mama, I just want Indomie." Parents were confused. The villagers were worried, but no one could resist Rita's food. And every single day, Rita made 3 full pots of Indomie. She never made more, no matter how much people begged. She never ran out of ingredients, no matter how much she cooked. And every night, when the village was asleep, she prepared her Indomie in secret. Because what the villagers didn't know was that Rita's special Indomie was not ordinary. The night was dark. The village was silent. Everyone was asleep. But not Rita. She moved quietly through the narrow paths, holding a small black bag. Her eyes darted left and right, making sure no one was watching. She was heading towards a place no villager dared to go at night. The mortuary. Rita stepped carefully into the cold, dark building. The air was thick with the smell of death. She moved past rows of dead bodies, her face calm, as if she had done this many times before. She stopped beside a fresh corpse, a man who had died only the day before. Slowly, she reached into her bag and brought out a small knife. With steady hands, she cut into the decaying flesh, carefully picking out fat white worms wriggling in the dead man's body. She smiled as she dropped the worms into her bag. "This is the secret," she whispered. This was what made her Indomie different. The worms of the dead. She needed them. She craved them. And the villagers, they ate them every day without knowing. By sunrise, the village was already awake, waiting for Rita. The queue was longer than ever. People pushed and shouted, "Rita, hurry up! Rita, give me 2 plates today." The king's guard stood at the front, holding a royal plate. "The king wants extra Indomie today." Rita smiled sweetly. "Don't worry, there is enough for everyone." She uncovered her pot, and immediately the delicious aroma filled the air. People sighed in relief. "Ah, that smell! My body is shaking. I need to eat this now." One by one, she served them, watching as they took their first bite. Their faces changed, their eyes filled with pleasure. They chewed slowly, their minds sinking into the spell of Rita's Indomie. But what nobody noticed was this. Each bite was changing them. The children who ate it became different. They stopped listening to their parents. They only listened to Rita. The women who ate it became restless. The men who ate it became angry. Couples started fighting over small things. The village was slowly falling apart. And Rita? She just smiled. Because her plan was working perfectly. Days passed. Then weeks. and the village was no longer the same. Parents cried as their children stopped obeying them. A mother grabbed her son by the ear. "Chidi, why didn't you come home last night?" The boy yanked his ear away. "Leave me alone, Mama. You are not Rita." His mother gasped. "What did you just say?" "I said leave me alone," Chidi shouted and ran off. The mother collapsed on the ground, weeping. The children only respected Rita now. Even the elders noticed the change. "What is happening to our children?" An old man asked, shaking his head. "Not just the children," another elder said. "Husbands and wives now fight every day." It was true. Couples who once loved each other now argued over nothing. "My husband slapped me yesterday," a woman cried. "My wife broke all my plates," another man complained. The entire village was in chaos, and still, every morning, they lined up at the market square, waiting for Rita's Indomie. No one could stop eating it. No one could explain why. Inside the palace, the king sat on his throne, thinking about Rita. She was all he wanted, her food, her smile, her voice. He could not understand why, but he knew one thing for sure. He needed Rita in his life. He turned to his guards. "Tell the people to prepare for a royal wedding." The guards exchanged confused glances. "My king, who are you marrying?" one of them asked. The king smiled. "Rita, of course." The guards were shocked. "But, my king, you already have 4 wives." The king's eyes darkened. "And now, I want a 5th. Go and tell the elders, Rita will be my wife." Kenny sat in her house, staring at her son. He had just refused to eat the rice she cooked. "But you love my rice," she said softly. The boy shook his head. "I only want Rita's Indomie." A chill ran down Kenny's spine. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. She had to find out what. That night, Kenny could not sleep. Her mind was troubled. Why was the whole village acting strange? Why were children disrespecting their parents? Why was the king obsessed with Rita? She had too many questions, and only one person could have the answers: Rita. So, while the village slept, Kenny stayed awake. She sat by her window, watching, waiting, and then she saw something: a shadow moving through the village. It was Rita. Kenny's heart pounded. Rita was heading towards the forest. But why? Kenny's hands shook as she grabbed a wrapper and tied it around her waist. She had to follow her. She moved quietly, staying in the darkness, careful not to be seen. She followed Rita through the narrow paths, past the trees, past the river, until they reached a dark, quiet place. Kenny froze. The mortuary. Her breath caught in her throat. What was Rita doing here? She hid behind a tree and watched. Rita entered the mortuary. Minutes passed. Then, Rita came out, holding a small black bag. Kenny squinted, trying to see what was inside. And then, Rita opened the bag and pulled out fat, white worms. Kenny gasped. She quickly covered her mouth, afraid that Rita would hear her. She watched in horror as Rita smiled at the worms before putting them back inside her bag. Then, Rita turned and started walking back to her house. Kenny's legs felt weak. Her mind screamed, "Run!" But she forced herself to stay quiet. She had just uncovered Rita's deadly secret. Rita was cooking Indomie with worms from dead bodies. Kenny had to tell someone. Kenny rushed home, her heart racing. She shook her husband awake. "Wake up! Wake up!" she whispered urgently. Her husband groaned. "What is it, woman?" Kenny's voice was shaking. "It's Rita. I followed her. I saw everything." Her husband sat up. "Saw what?" Kenny swallowed hard. "She is cooking Indomie with worms from dead bodies. That's why people are acting strange. That's why the king is obsessed with her." Her husband's eyes widened. "This is bad," he muttered. That night they went to Rita's house and they hid somewhere and saw her bought out the worms to prepare Indomie. Her husband was shocked. Kenny grabbed his hand. You have to tell the king. We must stop her before it's too late. Her husband hesitated, but then he remembered how even the king had changed, how the whole village was under Rita's spell. He nodded. I will tell the king first thing in the morning. At sunrise, Kenny and her husband rushed to the palace. They banged on the king's door. My king, please wake up. This is urgent. After a while, the door opened. The king stepped out looking annoyed. What is the meaning of this? He asked. Kenny and her husband fell to their knees. My king, forgive us, but we bring terrible news, her husband said. The king folded his arms. Speak. Kenny took a deep breath. It's about Rita. The king's expression softened. What about my beautiful Rita? Kenny hesitated. My king, Rita is evil. She is cooking Indomie with worms from dead bodies. That is why the village is acting strange. That is why you— Enough, the king roared. Kenny flinched. How dare you speak such lies about my future wife? The king thundered. My king, it's the truth, Kenny's husband pleaded. The king glared at them. Get out of my palace. But my king, I said get out. Kenny and her husband had no choice. They bowed their heads and left. But as they walked out, Kenny clenched her fists. The king refused to believe them. But the people must know the truth. If the king would not listen, then the people must know the truth. They rushed to the market square, where Rita was already selling her Indomie. The queue was long. People were eating, smiling, licking their plates. The king's guard was already waiting with the royal plate. The smell of the Indomie filled the air, but Kenny had no time for that. She ran straight to the front of the line and shouted at the top of her voice. The whole market fell silent. People turned to look at her. Rita froze, her hands shaking as she held a plate of Indomie. She forced a smile. Auntie Kenny, what is the meaning of this? Kenny pointed a shaking finger at her. You are poisoning this village. Gasps filled the air. People looked at each other in confusion. Rita laughed nervously. What are you saying? Everyone knows my Indomie is the best. Kenny's husband stepped forward. Tell them the truth, Rita. Tell them what you put inside your food. Rita's face darkened. She glanced at the crowd, then at the king's guard. She could see fear and suspicion growing in their eyes. People started whispering. What does she mean? What's inside the Indomie? Kenny took a deep breath and pointed at Rita's cooking pot. Do you people want to know the truth? Open that pot. Rita's heart skipped a beat. The crowd moved closer. Open it, someone shouted. Yes, let's see what's inside. Rita panicked and tried to run, but the angry villagers were faster. Catch her, someone screamed. Rita dashed through the crowd, pushing people out of her way. Her scarf flew off. Her pot nearly slipped from her hands. She ran as fast as she could, her heart pounding. But she didn't get far. The angry youths caught her. They dragged her back to the center of the market, her pot still in her hands. Open it, they shouted. No, Rita screamed, struggling. But they overpowered her. A strong young man ripped the pot from her hands and threw the lid open. Silence. Then, screams, horrified gasps. The crowd staggered back. Inside the pot, instead of fresh Indomie, they saw something wriggling. Fat, white worms. Moving. Alive. A woman covered her mouth and vomited. Another man collapsed on the ground. Rita trembled. The crowd turned to her, their faces filled with shock, disgust, and rage. You have been feeding us this? Someone shouted. You are a witch, another screamed. The king's guard fell to his knees, crying. The king has been eating this. The whole village exploded in anger. Rita knew she was finished. She tried to run again, but this time she did not escape. The angry youths pounced on her. They dragged her through the market, beating her mercilessly. She screamed. She struggled, but they did not stop. And then something terrible happened. Rita began to change. As the villagers beat Rita mercilessly, something strange started happening. Her skin began to wrinkle, her hair turned gray, her voice grew deeper. The people staggered back in shock. Rita laughed, a cold, evil laugh. She stood up, taller, stronger. But then, right before their eyes, her body began to change again. Her wrinkles disappeared, her hair turned black, her skin became smooth again, and suddenly, Rita was a young girl once more. The truth is that Rita is an old woman who chose to live in a young woman body until she lives this world. The native doctor helped her to remain forever young. The villagers gasped in horror. Even Kenny and her husband stared, frozen with fear. Rita smiled bitterly. "You fools," she said. "You think I came here for nothing? You think this was just about Indomie?" She took a deep breath and her eyes filled with pain. "I came here for revenge." The villagers looked at one another, confused. "Revenge for what?" an elder asked. Rita's face darkened. Tears filled her eyes, but she wiped them away angrily. "My mother died when I was very young," she began. Her voice was shaky but filled with deep pain. "I grew up with only my father. He was the only one I had. He was a good man, a kind man. He worked in the palace, serving the king with loyalty." The villagers listened in silence. But one day, Rita's fists clenched. One day the queen, yes, the king's own wife, tried to seduce my father. Gasps filled the air. The villagers stared at each other in shock. Even the palace guards shifted uncomfortably. Rita's eyes burned with anger. But my father was a man of honor. He refused her. He told her that he could never do such a wicked thing to his king. A tear rolled down her cheek. But the queen, she was wicked. She was evil. She hated rejection. So she did the worst thing imaginable. Rita took a deep, shaky breath. "She lied." The villagers leaned closer. The queen went to the king and told him that my father tried to force himself on her. The entire village gasped in horror. Some women covered their mouths. Questions
The men
without
shook
allowing
their
my
heads.
father to
The
explain
king's guards
himself,
exchanged
ordered him to be
nervous
burned
glances.
alive.
Rita's voice
Shouts of
broke
shock
with
rang
emotion.
through the crowd.
The king,
Some people
without
even started
asking,
crying. Rita closed her eyes as if reliving the memory. "I was there," she whispered. "I watched as they tied my father to a stake. I watched as they set him on fire. I heard his screams. I saw his flesh burn." Tears poured down her face. "I was just a little girl," she sobbed. "They took everything from me. They left me with nothing." She looked up, her eyes filled with rage. "So I swore that one day I would come back and destroy this kingdom." The villagers stared in shock. Rita laughed bitterly. "And that is exactly what I did." She looked around at the people, at the confusion, at the pain. "I made your children stubborn. I made your marriages fail. I made your king fall in love with me. I turned your whole village upside down." She spread her arms and smiled. "And you never even knew it was me." The villagers shivered. Even Kenny took a step back. The truth was out, but it was far from over. Rita wiped her tears and looked at the terrified villagers. "You think this is over?" she whispered. She shook her head. "No, this began a long time ago, the day you killed my father." She took a deep breath, her mind going back to that terrible night. After she watched her father burn in flames, Rita had nowhere to go. She was just a small girl, hungry, alone, lost. So she ran. She ran through the forests. She ran for days, her tiny feet bleeding. She finally collapsed in a neighboring village. A kind old woman found her, took her in, and raised her. But Rita never forgot. Every night she had the same nightmare, her father screaming in the fire, and every morning she woke up with just one thought. Many years passed. One day she heard the news. The wicked king was dead. His son had taken over the throne. Rita smiled bitterly. She knew this was the time to strike. But how? How could she destroy the kingdom that took everything from her? She needed power. She needed something stronger than weapons. She needed darkness. So, one night, she traveled deep into the forbidden forest. She walked for hours, following the whispers of the night spirits, and then she found him, the most feared native doctor in the land. His shrine was filled with skulls. His eyes were pure white. He did not blink. He did not smile. The moment he saw her, he said, "I have been expecting you." Rita's heart pounded. "How did you—" The native doctor raised a hand. "I know what you seek. I know what you want." Rita's lips trembled. "I want revenge. I want to destroy the village that took my father from me." The native doctor smiled for the first time. A slow, evil smile. He nodded. "There is a way." Rita stepped closer. "Tell me." The native doctor bent forward. His voice was low, like a snake hissing. "You must sell them food." Rita frowned. "Food?" The native doctor nodded. "But not just any food." He reached into a clay pot and pulled out something wriggling. Rita gasped. "Worms. Fat, white worms." "The worms of the dead," the native doctor whispered. Rita's stomach turned. "Eat this, and it will change you forever." She hesitated, but then she saw her father's face in her mind, burning, screaming. Her eyes hardened. She reached out and grabbed the worms. She swallowed them. Instantly, her body shivered. Her skin turned gray. Her hair fell off. She collapsed, screaming. The native doctor watched in silence. And then, Rita stood up. She looked at her reflection in a bowl of water. Her face was young again. Her beauty was 10 times stronger. She touched her skin. It was soft, fresh. She looked like an innocent girl. But inside her, she was a monster. The native doctor nodded. "Now you are ready." Rita smiled, a dark, dangerous smile. She was going back to her village, and this time she would not leave until the whole village was destroyed. The villagers stared at her in horror. Even the king could not speak. Rita laughed coldly. "You ate my food. You let me inside your homes. You made me your queen." She shook her head. "But this is just the beginning." She raised her hands, and then something terrifying happened. As Rita stood there, her laughter filling the air, the villagers trembled in fear. But then Kenny stepped forward. She walked past the frightened crowd, her heart beating fast. She stretched her hand and gently tapped Rita on the shoulder. "Rita," she said softly. Rita froze. Nobody had ever dared to touch her. Slowly, she turned around, her eyes filled with fire. "What?" she hissed. Kenny took a deep breath. "You shouldn't have punished the whole village," she said. Rita's eyes flickered. "The people did nothing to you. It was the former king who wronged you, not them," Kenny continued. The villagers nodded in agreement. Rita's fingers clenched. She wanted to argue. She wanted to scream. But deep inside, she knew Kenny was right. Tears filled her eyes. All these years, all this pain, she had allowed anger to consume her. And now, standing here, she felt empty. She looked at the villagers, the same people who had once loved her. She had hurt them. She had turned their children against them. She had almost destroyed everything. The air became calm. The villagers whispered in relief. The king stepped forward. He looked at Rita with sympathy. "Come with me to the palace," he said gently. Rita hesitated, but something in the king's eyes told her that he truly meant no harm. So she followed him. Rita stood before the throne. surrounded by chiefs, elders, and villagers. She had been here before, as a little girl, watching her father die. But now she was here as a different person. The king took a deep breath. "Rita," he said, his voice filled with regret. "My father made a terrible mistake. He was blinded by lies and acted in anger. I know I cannot undo the past, but please find it in your heart to forgive us." The villagers bowed their heads. They felt guilty. They felt ashamed. Rita closed her eyes. For years she had carried this hatred. It had made her strong, but it had also made her lonely. And now, after everything, she was tired. She was done. Slowly she opened her eyes and said the words that shocked everyone. "I forgive you." A deep silence fell over the palace, and then cheers erupted. People clapped, some even cried. The king smiled, and for the first time in years, Rita smiled too. Peace had returned. The king wanted to show his gratitude, so he built a grand house for Rita. A house so beautiful that people traveled from other villages to see it. He gave her maids to serve her. He made sure she never lacked anything. The villagers welcomed her as one of their own. And for the first time in her life, Rita felt happiness. She was no longer an orphan. She was no longer alone. She had a family again, and though she could never forget her father's death, she finally found peace